Beneath the neon glow of Tokyo's Shinjuku district, a storm was brewing, not just in the sky, but in the shadows that lurked beyond the flashing billboards and bustling crowds. Johnny Depp stepped out of a dimly lit alley, his sharp silhouette momentarily swallowed by the golden haze of streetlights. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and the distant aroma of sizzling yakitori from a food stall down the road. A digital screen high above flickered between advertisements, casting eerie reflections on the damp pavement. A sleek, black sedan idled at the curb, its tinted windows revealing nothing of the world inside. A man in a charcoal suit leaned against the hood, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his fedora. "Mr. Depp," the man greeted, his voice steady but edged with something unspoken. "You weren't followed, were you?" Johnny, adjusting his sunglasses despite the midnight hour, smirked. "If I was, they'll have a hell of a time keeping up." He slid into the backseat, the door clicking shut with quiet finality. As the car pulled away, weaving through the electric jungle of the city, Johnny cast a glance at the driver, a familiar figure with tired eyes and a quiet intensity. Thomas, always reliable, always watching. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the city was whispering, and Johnny had a feeling that before the sun rose, he would find out why. As Johnny prepared to step into the luxurious leather interior of the limo, a sudden blur of movement caught his eye. A small figure darted past him with startling speed, and before he could fully process what was happening, he felt tiny arms wrap around his leg in a desperate grip. He looked down. A frail, bald little girl clung to him with trembling fingers, her chest rising and falling rapidly as if she had been running for her life. Her wide, frightened eyes weren't on him, they were locked on something in the distance. Something unseen but clearly terrifying. Johnny's instinct kicked in. He crouched slightly, placing a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder. His voice dropped to a soothing murmur. "Hey," he said softly, trying to catch her gaze. "Are you okay?" Before she could answer, a sharp, angry voice cut through the air like a whip. "Hey, you there!" The girl flinched violently. For a split second, her grip on Johnny's leg tightened as if he was the only thing tethering her to safety. Then, without a word, she released him and bolted, vanishing into the churning sea of pedestrians. Her small frame swallowed by the chaos of the city. Johnny straightened, his brows furrowing as a red-faced man stormed toward him. The man, clad in a grease-stained apron bearing the logo of a nearby convenience store, barely seemed to register whom he was addressing. His attention was locked onto the direction the girl had run. His mouth twisted in a sneer. "That kid," he spat, frustration lacing every word, "always lurking around my store, scaring off customers. Nothing but bad luck, I tell you." Johnny's gaze lingered on the man, his expression unreadable. "Bad luck?" he echoed, his voice deceptively light. She looked more scared than anything. The store owner scoffed. "She doesn't steal, not exactly, but she's always there, touching everything, watching everyone, always watching. Freaks people out, I tell you. It's only a matter of time before she takes something." His voice grew harsher, as if justifying his anger to himself. "She's waiting for a moment of weakness. I see it in her eyes." Finally, the man turned his focus back to Johnny, and the color drained from his face. His anger dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer mortification. His mouth opened, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. "Oh my God," he stammered. You're Johnny Depp." Johnny's expression remained cool, his dark eyes unreadable. He raised a hand, silencing the man's flustered apologies before they could begin. "It's all right," he said, his voice even. Then, tilting his head slightly, he added, "But let me ask you again, has that girl ever actually done anything wrong?" Silence. The man's mouth opened again, but no words came, and in that moment, Johnny knew the answer. The store owner shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering between Johnny and the direction where the girl had disappeared. His mouth twisted, as if grappling with words he didn't quite want to admit. "Well, no," he finally muttered. "I told you, she ain't done nothing wrong. But she's always there, it ain't right." Johnny nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Then, in a measured, almost philosophical tone, he replied, "I've learned that judging someone for a crime they haven't committed is the fastest way to miss the truth. Maybe there's more to her story than we can see." The store owner grunted, but his bravado had faded. He didn't meet Johnny's gaze. With one last glance, Johnny turned and strode toward the waiting limousine. Thomas, ever efficient, held the door open before stepping inside and pulling it shut behind them. As the vehicle hummed to life, muffling the noise of the street, Johnny caught the faintest grumble from outside. "I don't like celebrities like you." The shopkeeper muttered, never caring about what's really going on in the world. The words barely reached Johnny, but something about them gnawed at the back of his mind. As the limousine slipped into the steady flow of traffic, He leaned back in his seat, his thoughts lingering on the girl, her frightened eyes, the store owner's misplaced frustration, and the way she had clung to him like he was the only safe harbor in a storm. The city outside blurred past in a whirlwind of neon signs and morning commuters. Yet, even as they left the store behind, a nagging feeling took root in Johnny's chest. He leaned forward. Thomas. His voice carried a quiet urgency. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Yes, sir, can you slow down? I want to keep an eye out for something. Thomas didn't question it. He simply nodded and eased the limo into a more leisurely crawl through the bustling streets. Of course, Mr. Depp. Is everything all right? Johnny's gaze swept over the sidewalks, scanning the moving sea of people. His brow furrowed in concentration. I don't know, he admitted. There's a kid out there. I need to make sure she's okay. She's bald, looks about 9 or 10 years old. Help me look. Understood, sir. Thomas's response was swift, steady, reassuring. The limo moved with unhurried precision, weaving through the morning rush. Outside, the city was alive with motion, street vendors setting up for the day, businessmen lost in their phones, clusters of tourists pausing to take pictures. Johnny's eyes darted from one face to another. Nothing. Then, a small, frail figure huddled against a wall near another convenience store. A block down, his chest tightened. Thomas, pull over. The limo glided to a halt, and Johnny stepped onto the sidewalk, slipping his sunglasses into place as he made his way toward the girl. She sat curled against the cold concrete, a tiny paper cup stretched out in front of her, her posture speaking of exhaustion and quiet resignation. For a moment, she didn't seem to notice him. Then her gaze lifted, recognition sparked in her eyes. Johnny crouched down to her level, his voice gentle but warm. Hello again. Reaching into his wallet, he pulled out several large bills and dropped them into her cup. Her eyes widened at the sight, but before she could speak, she lunged forward, wrapping her small arms around his leg once more. This time, it wasn't fear, it was relief. Thank you, she murmured, her voice muffled against the fabric of his pants. Then, as she pulled back, her wonder-filled eyes searched his face. Are you, Captain Jack Sparrow? She asked, almost in awe. Where's your ship? Johnny let out a soft chuckle, warmth spreading through his chest despite the heaviness of the situation, slipping effortlessly into Jack Sparrow's voice. He quirked an eyebrow. Ah, my love, he drawled, the Black Pearl is anchored in a secret cove, waiting for her next grand adventure. The girl giggled, her small fingers tightening around the paper cup, but just as quickly as the joy appeared, it flickered, her smile faltered. She hesitated, glancing around nervously before leaning in. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Captain Jack Sparrow, please, help me. Johnny's fingers instinctively moved toward his wallet again, but the girl shook her head, vehemently. Not money, she said, her eyes pleading. I need. Her voice hitched, and for the first time, true fear darkened her expression. Before the girl could finish her sentence, a murmur rippled through the crowd. At first, it was just a few onlookers. Then more, faces turned, phones were raised, the whispering spread like wildfire. Is that Johnny Depp? What's he doing with that kid? Wait, get a picture. The growing attention was like a wave crashing forward, fans inching closer, their voices rising in excitement. Some were merely curious, others eager for a selfie, but none of them noticed the way the little girl flinched. Johnny felt her small body stiffen before she shrank back against the wall, her earlier courage evaporating in the chaos. Her breathing quickened, panic flashing in her wide eyes. He took a step back, shielding her instinctively, his posture relaxed but his mind already assessing the situation. Too much attention, too fast. Thomas, ever watchful, moved swiftly, his deep voice cut through the commotion like a knife. Step back, please, give him space. His presence alone was enough to make some hesitate. But a few fans, too caught up in their excitement, still pushed forward. One jostled Johnny's arm, another stepped too close, their phones flashing. Johnny moved smoothly, pivoting towards the limousine. No sudden movements, no alarm, just control. Thomas guided him with a steady hand, his grip firm on Johnny's shoulder as he opened the limo door. The second Johnny was inside, Thomas shut the door with precision, sealing off the outside world. The noise faded into a distant hum. Through the tinted window, Johnny searched for the girl. His stomach tightened as he caught a final glimpse of her, small, frightened, swallowed by the restless crowd. Then, like smoke in the wind, she was gone. Damn it, Mr. Depp, I'm sorry, but we should go, Thomas said, his tone measured, professional. Your schedule, sir. Johnny didn't answer at first. His gaze lingered on the sidewalk, scanning for any trace of the child. She was nowhere to be seen. He exhaled, finally turning to Thomas, his voice low. Yeah, I hear you, But his mind was elsewhere. His fingers tapped absently against the leather seat. His thoughts tangled in the image of her wide, desperate eyes. "I'll be back." The word slipped out barely above a whisper. A promise. A vow. Thomas signaled the driver, and the limousine eased back into traffic. Johnny's phone buzzed. He hesitated before answering. "Yes? Mr. Depp. Just confirming you're still on schedule for the magazine shoot." The voice on the other end was brisk. Professional. Johnny rubbed his temple, forcing himself to focus. "Yeah, everything's still on schedule. I'm on my way." The call ended, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. "No, not yet." He turned to Thomas. "We have a few minutes, right?" His voice had shifted, no longer distracted, but determined. Thomas checked the time. "About 5 minutes, sir, if you want to be exactly on time." Johnny's jaw tightened. "Turn back." Thomas glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but he didn't question it. He simply gave a short nod and relayed the order. The limousine pivoted, weaving back through the city streets with effortless precision. Johnny's eyes never left the window. He searched. "Please, just be there." As they neared the spot where he had last seen her, his pulse quickened. The crowd was gone. The wall where she had sat was empty. No sign of the girl. His stomach sank. "Stop here, Thomas." The limousine glided to a halt outside the convenience store. Johnny exhaled sharply. "She has to be nearby." "I'm going to take a quick look inside," he said, already reaching for the door handle. "I won't be long." And before Thomas could protest, Johnny stepped out onto the sidewalk, his heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. The bell above the door jingled softly as Johnny stepped into the store. The harsh glare of fluorescent lights flickered against the dull linoleum floor, casting sterile shadows across the aisles stacked with snacks, canned goods, and household essentials. A faint hum from the refrigeration units filled the air, broken only by the occasional electronic chime of the cash register and the rhythmic tapping of fingers against a phone screen. Behind the counter, a teenage cashier, his face illuminated by the cold glow of his mobile game, barely acknowledged Johnny's entrance. His thumbs danced over the screen, lost in whatever battle was playing out in his hands. Moving with practiced ease, Johnny scanned the store, his sharp eyes sweeping over each aisle. No sign of her. He checked near the refrigerators, past the racks of instant noodles and cheap toys. But there was nothing, no movement. No small, trembling figure tucked between the shelves. Frustration coiled in his chest. With measured steps, he approached the counter. The cashier, sensing a presence, finally glanced up. His bored expression shifted ever so slightly, recognition flickering behind his dull gaze. "Excuse me," Johnny said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I'm looking for a little girl, bald, about this tall." He gestured with his hand. "Have you seen her come in here recently?" The teenager barely hesitated before shaking his head. "Nope, haven't seen no kids here today." And just like that, he dropped his gaze back to his phone, dismissing Johnny without a second thought. Johnny lingered for a beat, watching him, searching for any sign of hesitation, any hint of dishonesty. There was nothing. Swallowing his disappointment, he gave a small nod of thanks and stepped back onto the street. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows between the buildings. The sidewalks pulsed with the afternoon rush, office workers heading home, street vendors hawking their wares, the ever-present murmur of the city thick in the air. Johnny took a few steps in either direction, peering down nearby alleys, checking darkened corners and recessed doorways. His gut told him she was still close. But where? With every passing second, the reality of his time constraints pressed down on him. He couldn't afford to linger too long, not unless he wanted another swarm of fans descending upon him. Finally, with reluctant acceptance, he turned and made his way back to the waiting limousine. Sliding into the back seat, he let out a quiet breath and pulled out his phone. His calendar glowed back at him, a relentless stretch of commitments, appointments, and obligations, a stark reminder of the world he lived in, the responsibilities waiting for him. Thomas started the engine, the quiet purr of the car filling the space. As they pulled into the street, Johnny stared absently out the window, his mind still caught on the girl's desperate eyes, the way she had clung to him, the way she had pleaded, not for money, but for something else. Maybe she's gone for good. The thought landed heavily in his chest, a dull ache settling in. Then, a soft tap against the glass. Johnny blinked, turning his head slowly. Through the tinted window, a small face pressed against the glass, hands cupped around wide, searching eyes. His heart leapt. Her, even in the distorted gloom of the reflection. He recognized her, the frail frame, the unmistakable bald head. And then he noticed something else. She wasn't just looking for him. She was desperate. Johnny's gaze darted to the traffic signal. The countdown was ticking down, only a few seconds left before the light changed. No time. With a surge of instinct, He reached for the door handle. "Wait," Johnny started, but there was no hesitation. In one swift motion, he flung the door open, reached out, and pulled her into the limousine just as the light switched to green. The door shut with a solid thud, sealing him off from the world outside. The soft creak of the leather seats echoed as she settled into the plush interior. The contrast was almost jarring, her tiny, fragile frame surrounded by opulence. Thomas flicked a glance at the rearview mirror, his brow raising slightly in surprise. But he said nothing. With seamless control, he guided the limousine forward, merging smoothly into traffic. For a long moment, neither Johnny nor the girl spoke. Inside the climate-controlled sanctuary of the limousine, she seemed to relax slightly, her wide eyes roaming the luxurious space in quiet awe. Johnny, however, was watching her. "What are you running from?" He leaned forward slightly, voice low but steady. "All right, kid," he said gently. "You've got my attention. Now tell me, what is it you really need?" The girl swallowed hard, glancing around as if still afraid she might be overheard. Then, in a whisper barely above a breath, she said, "They're coming for me." Johnny watched her carefully, his sharp eyes catching the way she unconsciously rubbed her arms, as if she were cold, despite the limousine's perfectly comfortable temperature. "Something's wrong." Keeping his voice gentle, he asked, "What's your name?" The girl hesitated for a moment before answering in a small, almost fragile voice. "Sonia." Johnny offered her a reassuring smile. "It's nice to meet you, Sonia." He paused, then added, "Can you tell me what kind of help you need?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Instead, she lifted a trembling finger and pointed out the window. Johnny followed her gaze. They were passing a rundown, dilapidated building with a faded sign in front that read, AG. The letters were large but weathered, their edges chipped and peeling. His brows furrowed. "What is that place?" Before he could ask, Sonia made another gesture, this time far more personal. Her small fingers rose to her bald head. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she pulled up her sleeve. Johnny's stomach tightened. Dark bruises mottled her pale skin, stark against the frailness of her tiny arm. The air in the limousine seemed to shift. The gravity of the moment sank into Johnny like a weight pressing against his ribs. "Help, sir." Her voice wavered, barely above a whisper, but those two words carried the force of 1,000 silent cries. Johnny leaned closer, his gaze fixed on the bruises, the pallor of her skin, the quiet plea in her wide, tired eyes. A grim realization settled over him like a cold fog. His voice softened, but there was an unmistakable urgency beneath it. "Sonia, are you sick? Is that why you need help?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she gave a small nod. "The doctors at the orphanage said I need special medicine," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but they don't have enough money. I tried to save up. But," she gestured weakly toward the few coins and crumpled bills in her paper cup. The sight of it twisted something deep in Johnny's chest. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Johnny turned sharply toward Thomas. "Can you find somewhere to park near the orphanage we just passed?" His tone left no room for argument. "We need to speak to someone there. Now." Thomas, ever composed, gave a quick nod. "Of course, Mr. Depp." With smooth precision, he changed lanes and maneuvered the limousine for a U-turn. Johnny, meanwhile, kept his attention on Sonia. As they drew nearer to the orphanage, she seemed to shrink in on herself, her earlier courage dissolving into something more fragile. Her shoulders hunched, her hands curled into fists on her lap. Anxiety flickered across her face like a shadow. Johnny noticed. He gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Everything's going to be okay," he promised, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together." "All right," Sonia nodded, but the attempted smile on her lips was barely more than a flicker. The limousine pulled to a halt in front of the orphanage. Johnny stepped out first, then extended a hand to help Sonia. Her fingers curled into his, small and cold, but as they approached the entrance, her steps slowed, then slowed further. By the time they reached the bottom of the short flight of stairs, she had nearly stopped altogether. Johnny glanced down just in time to see her knees buckle. "Sonia." He reached for her, but gravity was faster. Her tiny body crumpled. She tumbled down the last few steps, hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. "Sonia." Johnny was at her side in an instant, his heart pounding. She was conscious. That was the first thing he checked. Her eyelids fluttered weakly, and a soft whimper escaped her lips. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. Blood, a thin trickle seeped from a fresh cut on her forehead. "Damn it." Johnny's hands moved automatically, his instincts taking over. He cradled her head gently, his fingers brushing the wound, his mind racing through every possible scenario. Broken bones? Concussion? Internal bleeding? Think, Johnny, think. His free hand fumbled for his phone. And within seconds, He was dialing emergency services. As soon as the operator answered, his voice was clipped and urgent. "I have a child, Sonia. She's taken a fall outside an orphanage. She's conscious, but she's bleeding, and I don't know if she has any other injuries. We need medical assistance immediately." The operator asked him to stay on the line, guiding him through basic first aid. Johnny barely heard it. His focus was entirely on Sonia, her shallow breathing, the way her fingers curled weakly in his shirt. He tightened his grip around her small frame, offering what little comfort he could. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured, his voice low, filled with something raw. "Help is on the way." And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The late afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across Sonia's pale face, emphasizing the fear and pain etched into her delicate features. Johnny's heart pounded as he cradled the frail girl in his arms, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like an unbearable force. The reality of her condition, the sheer fragility of the child in front of him, was sinking in. As he ended the call to emergency services, the heavy front door of the orphanage suddenly swung open. A woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun hurried down the steps. Her movements swift despite her age. Her face, lined with years of experience, was filled with worry. "Oh, my God," she gasped, rushing toward them. "What happened?" Johnny barely looked up, his focus still on Sonia. "She collapsed on the steps," he explained quickly. "I called an ambulance." The woman knelt beside them, surprisingly agile. "I'm Abigail," she said, her voice carrying both authority and genuine concern. "I'm the caretaker here. We saw what happened on our security cameras, and I came as quickly as I could." Her hands, gentle yet firm, brushed against Sonia's clammy forehead. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, her eyes clouded with worry. "What have you done to yourself this time?" For a moment, her gaze shifted to Johnny, something unreadable flickering in her expression. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke, her voice quieter now, tinged with a sadness that had long settled in her bones. "Sonia has cancer." The words hit Johnny like a punch to the gut. Abigail continued, her voice steady but laced with grief. "Because of her condition, she's weak, unsteady. Falls are not uncommon. We've done everything we can to care for her." But, she broke off, her voice catching in her throat. Johnny didn't need her to finish the sentence. He already knew how it ended. Before he could respond, the distant wail of a siren shattered the moment, growing louder as an ambulance rounded the corner. The vehicle screeched to a halt at the curb, red and blue lights flashing against the darkening sky. Within seconds, two paramedics jumped out, medical gear in hand. Johnny stepped back, but Sonia's small fingers clutched weakly at his sleeve. "Captain Sparrow," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. His chest tightened. "Can you come with me?" Her tiny hand trembled as she reached for his. Johnny met Abigail's eyes, searching for an answer. The woman gave him a small, encouraging nod. Without hesitation, he squeezed Sonia's hand gently. "Of course, sweetheart," he murmured. "I'll always be with you." As the paramedics worked swiftly, assessing Sonia's vitals and preparing to load her into the ambulance, one of them turned to Johnny with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but only one person can ride with her, and it has to be her legal guardian." Johnny exhaled sharply but nodded, understanding. Crouching down, he spoke softly to Sonia. "Listen to me, kid," he said, his voice low and steady. "Abigail's going to go with you in the ambulance. But I promise," he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "I'll meet you at the hospital. My ship will be right behind." Sonia hesitated, her lips quivering. "You promise, Honor?" Johnny's lips twitched, and despite everything, a familiar twinkle lit his eyes. "Honor among pirates," he assured her. A small, exhausted smile appeared on Sonia's face. As the paramedics carefully lifted her onto the stretcher, Abigail climbed in beside her, squeezing her tiny hand for reassurance. The ambulance doors slammed shut. A moment later, its siren blared to life again, and the vehicle pulled away, weaving through traffic, its flashing lights disappearing into the distance. Johnny stood frozen for a moment, his hands still clenched at his sides. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Depp?" Johnny turned. Thomas stood beside him, waiting patiently, his gaze calm but alert. "We're following them," Johnny said firmly. Thomas gave a small nod. "Of course, sir, I won't lose them." Without another word, Johnny climbed into the limousine. The engine hummed to life, and as the car pulled into traffic, weaving expertly between vehicles, Johnny leaned forward, his sharp eyes locked on the flashing lights in the distance. He wasn't letting her out of his sight. Not now, not ever. As the limousine followed the ambulance through the winding streets of the city, Johnny sat in the back, lost in thought. The events of the past hour weighed heavily on him, Sonia's frail frame, the quiet desperation in her voice, the bruises, the truth about her illness. How long had she been suffering like this? What kind of life had she endured at the orphanage? And more importantly, what could he do to help? Thomas, ever focused, navigated the traffic with practiced precision, keeping a respectful distance while ensuring they didn't lose sight of the flashing lights ahead. The city blurred past in a haze of buildings and faces. But Johnny barely noticed. His thoughts remained fixed on the little girl who had unexpectedly stepped into his life. The emergency room buzzed with movement and urgency. As Johnny stepped through the sliding doors, the sharp scent of antiseptic filled his lungs. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead cast stark reflections on the sterile white floors, emphasizing the cold, clinical atmosphere of the hospital. His gaze swept across the waiting area. In the corner, an elderly woman with her grey hair scraped back into a tight bun sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. A nurse stood nearby, her expression weary but professional. Johnny hesitated for only a moment before approaching them. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "The little girl, Sonia, do you know how she's doing?" The elderly woman, Abigail, lifted her head, her tired eyes registering recognition. The nurse gave him a careful once-over before asking the inevitable question. "Are you family?" Johnny paused. For all intents and purposes, he wasn't. He had only met Sonia a short while ago, but something in him refused to let that define their connection. "I'm a friend," he finally said. His voice was steady, unwavering. "I brought her in. You can say she's family." The nurse nodded slightly before glancing toward the hallway beyond the waiting room. "The doctors are with her now." Johnny exhaled, stepping back slightly. He and Abigail settled into an uncomfortable silence, both waiting for news, their concern unspoken but palpable. After a few long minutes, Johnny decided to formally introduce himself to Abigail. "I'm Johnny," he said, offering a small, polite nod. She gave him a knowing look, as if she had already figured that out, but introduced herself anyway. "Abigail, I run the orphanage." They spoke in hushed tones, discussing Sonia, the orphanage, and the struggles of caring for sick children with limited resources. Then, the doctor appeared, a tall man in a white coat, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from years of delivering both hope and heartbreak. "We have her preliminary results," he announced. "Sonia has stage 3 cancer. She needs urgent surgery." Johnny had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a gut punch. Beside him, Abigail let out a quiet, shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. What did this mean for Sonia? What would happen next? Could she even afford the care she needed? As the questions swirled in Johnny's mind, Thomas sat nearby, silent and unobtrusive, as if sensing this was a moment that needed space. Finally, Johnny pushed himself to his feet. "Excuse me," he murmured, stepping away. Outside the waiting area, he pulled out his phone and dialed. The call connected almost immediately. "Johnny," his agent's voice came through, brisk and businesslike. "We need to confirm your arrival at the shoot." "I'm not coming." Silence. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "What, Johnny, do you realize what you're saying? We've got contracts, press, major financial commitments. You can't just." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Johnny's voice was calm, but firm. "Something more important has come up." A pause. Then, "Johnny, you can't just walk away from this. The magazine, the brand, this isn't a small deal." Johnny clenched his jaw. He knew what this meant: money, obligations, a ripple effect on an entire industry of people who depended on him showing up. But he also knew this. Sonia was alone in this world. If he walked away from her now, she had no one, and that wasn't something he could live with. "I don't care," he said simply. His agent exhaled sharply, clearly struggling to process the situation. "You're making a mistake, Johnny," came the clipped response. Johnny hung up. Thomas, who had been quietly waiting, finally spoke. "Everything all right, sir?" Johnny let out a slow breath. "No, but it will be." Thomas studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something deeper than words. Then, without a word, he pulled out his own phone and made a quick call. A few minutes later, a black car pulled up outside the hospital. Johnny arched a brow. "What's this?" Thomas offered a rare, small smile. "Toys, sir. Thought they might help." Johnny blinked, momentarily thrown. Then, as the weight of what Thomas had done settled in, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "You're a good man, Thomas." Thomas simply inclined his head. "I just figured she could use a little extra hope." Johnny glanced toward the hospital doors. Sonia was fighting a battle no child should have to face. But now, she wouldn't be fighting it alone. Johnny exhaled a slow, steady breath before turning to Abigail, his voice firm but laced with quiet determination. "What can I do?" Abigail hesitated, Her eyes filled with the weight of years spent watching children like Sonia fight battles they never should have had to face. "We'll give her the surgery," she said, voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But with a case this advanced, there are no guarantees." Johnny's jaw tightened. He refused to accept that. "I don't care what it takes." He took a step closer, his voice gaining strength. "Whatever she needs, surgery, treatment, rehabilitation, I'll cover it. Everything." Abigail blinked, stunned. "Johnny, this is beyond charity. You barely know her. Does that matter?" Johnny challenged. "She deserves a chance. She deserves a life." Abigail opened her mouth as if to protest, then stopped. There was something in Johnny's voice, something raw, something utterly unwavering. He wasn't doing this for show. He wasn't doing this out of guilt. He was doing this because he meant it. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening. "All right, if you're sure." Johnny turned, pushing through the hospital corridor towards Sonia's room. A nurse passing by glanced at him in surprise as he approached. "Where is her room?" he asked briskly. The nurse guided him down the hall, and as he stepped inside, he saw Sonia curled up on the hospital bed, looking even smaller beneath the crisp white sheets. A small bag sat beside her bed, filled with a few meager belongings. With the nurse's help, Johnny rummaged through it, pulling out a few small items, things that mattered to her. Then, sitting down beside her, he leaned forward. "I'm going to help you through this, kid." His voice was quiet but resolute. "No matter what." Sonia's tired eyes met his, filled with something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Words spread quickly. Doctors, nurses, hospital staff, all whispering about what Johnny Depp was doing for this little girl. Patients in nearby rooms peered out, watching as he helped adjust Sonia's bed, made sure she had water, and, most importantly, made her feel like she wasn't alone. When Thomas arrived with a box of toys, Johnny made a show of pulling them out, presenting each one like a grand reveal. "And here we have the finest stuffed parrot to ever grace the decks of a pirate ship," he announced dramatically, handing Sonia a plush bird. She giggled weakly, clutching it close. That night, Johnny sat beside her, reading story after story, tales of pirates, treasure hunts, and far-off lands. "I love these stories," Sonia murmured sleepily, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to read them myself one day." Johnny smiled. "You will." She drifted off, her breathing deep and even. And for the first time since meeting her, Johnny felt something other than worry. He felt hope. The morning came too soon. The doctors had begun prepping Sonia for surgery. Johnny sat outside the room, book in hand, but his mind was elsewhere. Abigail approached, worry etched across her face. "What if something goes wrong?" she whispered. "What if they hurt her?" Johnny closed his book, exhaling slowly. "She's going to be okay," he assured her. "We just have to wait." Abigail swallowed hard. "What can we do?" Johnny met her gaze. "We have hope, and a little faith." They sat together in silence, watching as the minutes stretched into hours. 5 hours later, the doctor finally emerged. Johnny and Abigail shot to their feet. The doctor removed his mask, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes holding a flicker of relief. The surgery was a success. A weight lifted from Johnny's chest. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Abigail pressed a hand to her heart, whispering a quiet, "Thank God." But then, the doctor's expression darkened slightly. "She'll need chemotherapy, a lot of it." Johnny's relief dimmed, replaced by renewed determination. "Will she be okay?" Abigail asked, her voice wavering. The doctor hesitated. "We can only hope. The prognosis is difficult to predict at this stage. But she has a fighting chance." Johnny's jaw tightened. "Then I'm in for the long haul." Abigail turned to him, studying him. "Are you sure? This isn't something that ends in a few weeks." "Johnny, this is months, maybe years, of treatment. Uncertainty, risk." Johnny's voice was quiet, but there was no doubt in it. "I don't care. I just want her to be okay." The doctor nodded. "Then we'll keep you updated every step of the way." As the news spread, something remarkable happened. The children from Sonia's orphanage began showing up, one by one, eager to see their friend. They brought small gifts, handmade drawings, paper flowers, little tokens of love. And for the first time in a long time, Sonia wasn't just a sick child in a hospital bed. She was surrounded by love. She was surrounded by family. And in that moment, Johnny knew, no matter what happened next, she wouldn't be fighting this battle alone. The orphanage, once struggling and forgotten, had become a place of warmth and hope. Laughter echoed through its halls, and dreams were no longer distant fantasies but achievable realities. Johnny, true to his word, had made a generous donation, ensuring that every child who walked through its doors had access to education, healthcare, and, most importantly, a future. But his greatest gift wasn't just money. It was his presence. He never let go of the connections he had built. He kept in touch, checking in on the kids as they grew, celebrating their successes, guiding them through their hardships, and reminding them that they were never truly alone. Over the years, many of them left to start lives of their own. Some pursued careers they had once only dreamed of. Others found families and love. But no matter where life took them, they always found their way back, to the orphanage, to Abigail, and to Johnny. And Sonia? Sonia, the little girl who had once clung to Johnny's leg in desperation, had beaten the impossible. She had fought her sickness with the heart of a warrior, endured the storm, and emerged stronger than ever. Now, standing on the deck of a ship, the wind in her hair and the salt of the sea on her lips, she gripped the helm with steady hands, a determined glint in her eyes. "Set sail," she called, her voice strong, fearless. And from the dock, watching proudly, Johnny tipped his hat. "Aye, Captain," he murmured with a smirk. Because she wasn't just living. She was thriving. And with every adventure ahead, she knew her greatest treasure was the man who had once promised her that pirates never back down from a fight. And Johnny? He knew that of all the roles he had ever played, of all the characters he had ever brought to life, being her friend was the greatest one of all.